The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency is reviewing results from its biannual simulated cyber attack. CISA says Cyberstorm was a success and the most extensive exercise of its kind in the country. Lisa Beury-Russo is Acting Deputy Associate Director for Exercises at CISA. Lisa, thanks very much for coming on. What is Cyberstorm? What were you trying to accomplish?
Francis, thanks so much for having me today. This is an opportunity for us to bring together stakeholders from the federal, state, and local government, private sector, and even international partners to build relationships and examine how we would collectively respond to a widespread cyber attack. As you noted, this exercise was very expansive. In fact, this year we had more than 200 participating organizations and over 2,000 individual players.
Who are those 200 participating organizations? Who are the people and the stakeholders that you want to be involved with this each time, Lisa?
So we aim for this to be a pretty expansive and inclusive exercise. Those 200 organizations represent, as I said, our federal department and agency partners, including CISA, of course, state and local governments, and a large number of critical infrastructure owner-operators in the private sector. This year, we had representation from 9 of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors. It was quite broad. And then within that, we aim to include anyone who'd be included in a cyber incident response. That includes the technical incident responders. It could include public affairs, leadership, HR, whatever that would look like within a given organization. We aim to include those individuals and those functions.
How do you measure the results that you got last time up against the results that you'll get this time to see what kind of progress you're making? And how do you accommodate the way the threat landscape changes from exercise to exercise, Lisa?
That's a great question. So Cyberstorm 2020 was actually our 7th iteration of this exercise. We've been doing it since 2006. And in each iteration, we aim to build on what we learned previously, but also forge into some new areas. So there were a couple things from the past that we sort of retested, particularly in looking at how we implement some plans and policies. And then there were some new areas that we explored as well. So in this one, for instance, we really wanted to look at some cross-sector activity, which is why we included so many different critical infrastructure sectors.
What does cross-sector activity mean? What kinds of threats are you looking at there?
That's a great question. We see a lot of common threats across sectors. So you may see ransomware targeting state and local governments, which we've seen in the news recently. But that same thing could be targeting businesses, perhaps in the financial sector or critical manufacturing, transportation. So we see a range of different vectors targeting a number of different sectors. And in some ways, this can be like assembling a puzzle. You know, each one of those organizations or sectors will have a piece, and we really need that coordination and cross-communication to assemble the entire picture.
What's your sense of how that coordination and cross-communication in the private sector, vertically and not just horizontally with you at DHS, how's that evolving? What is that like? Is it improving? Is it a steady state? What do you see?
You know, we see it improve every time we do one of these exercises. And one of the things we noticed during Cyberstorm 2020 was really the value of some of those vertical sharing organizations within the sector, what we call the ISACs and the ISAOs, or Information Sharing and Analysis Centers and Information Sharing and Analysis Organizations. Those were really valuable in putting together some pieces within the sector and then enabling that broader cross-sector sharing.
What are you seeing within the enterprise of the federal government as far as individual agencies' interactions with the private sector organizations, with the private sector stakeholders that they deal with on an ongoing basis, ingress and egress of data and so on?
Yeah, so we do have specific roles for the federal interagency in interacting with the private sector. One of those is the quote-unquote sector-specific agency, where there are different departments and agencies that have those roles. We see those roles as very strong, and we have great relationships between CISA and those other departments. We often have liaison officers that we share. So, for instance, if there's one SSA that's looking at information happening within that sector, the liaison officer is then also an additional conduit of information into CISA. So we kind of try to connect all the dots in that information sharing cycle.
You mentioned a couple of minutes ago how you gauged the response, the actual performances from one to another. What will you take away from Cyberstorm 2020 that will inform the way that you go about setting up Cyberstorm 2022 in a couple of years?
So I think there are a couple things. First, I'll note that this was our first Cyberstorm as CISA. I noted we've been doing this for a number of years, but it's been as NPPD and some of our predecessor organizations. So we learned some things internally that I think were really valuable. We also, as you likely know, we conducted this exercise in the middle of a pandemic. So we did learn some things about how we can better coordinate and communicate in this dispersed environment that I think will help us in our everyday steady state work, as well as a range of different scenarios that could come up. And we'll look to see how much of that we incorporate in the next cyberstorm. We're not quite sure what the future holds, but I think everyone's been pretty clear that we are probably not going back to exactly what used to be business as normal. It's going to be a new way. So we'll continue to include those lessons.
You probably didn't know when you right up to the last minute that you were planning for this, that you would be doing it in the middle of a pandemic, but you mentioned that you learned internal lessons from this, and I wonder what some of those might be. We have about a minute left.
Sure. You are correct. We certainly did not plan for this in the pandemic, and in fact, the exercise was originally scheduled for the spring and rescheduled it. But some of those lessons learned are just some plans we need to update, making some different connections across different functions. You may know in CISA, we now have a stakeholder engagement function, which is going to be hugely valuable to us in this sector and cross-sector outreach. So we had an opportunity to exercise some of those things. And I think we just need to maybe refine some plans and continue our growth. But overall, we really found that the exercise highlighted the value of CISA and those roles that we carry out for the broader cyber community.
Lisa, thanks very much for coming on. It's great to have you here. Appreciate the insight.
Thanks for the opportunity to join you.